Hello and welcome to this pre-recorded presentation. My name is Michael Heisel and I'll be talking about the shape of inertial subrange turbulence. My colleagues on this work are Marcelo Chemecki at UCLA, Charitha De Silva at New South Wales, and Gabby Catul at Duke University. Over the past several decades, both field measurements and numerical simulations have helped us to better understand the coherent turbulent motions in the atmospheric surface layer. For instance, under near neutrally stratified conditions, we observe low momentum streaks. An example of this is shown and easily apparent on the left side plot of the streamwise velocity, where the blue region represents these low momentum streaks. Shown here is a more three-dimensional representation of these streaks from laboratory measurements, where the blue region is a low momentum isosurface and the red is a high momentum isosurface. We also understand how these coherent motions can change under different stability conditions. For instance, in an unstable boundary layer, we observe thermal rolls for weak convection, and these rolls transition to open cells under strong convection. An example of these cells is easily apparent from the vertical velocity field on the right-hand side here. The scaling behavior of these coherent features can be related to different regions of the energy spectrum. An example spectrum is shown here for the streamwise velocity from boundary layer wind tunnel data. At the lowest wave numbers, we have the large scale motions whose size exceeds the boundary layer thickness. Delta here is the boundary layer thickness from a wind tunnel, which is analogous to the inversion height of the planetary boundary layer, at least for the purposes of this talk. Next, we have the production region with a -1 power law exponent corresponding to attached structures whose size is a function of the distance from the surface z. Then at intermediate scales, we have the inertial subrange exhibiting a universal -5/3 power law exponent. And finally, we have the dissipative structures governed by viscosity, whose size is on the order of the Kolmogorov microscale eta. The coherent regions shown earlier, such as the momentum streaks, have scaling behavior associated with the large-scale motions and the production region of the energy spectrum. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we can borrow understanding from the turbulence community, where the most frequently observed geometries are sheets, ribbons, and tubes. However, these are the idealized geometries, where in practice you're more likely to observe a sea of worm-like filaments, as seen in the middle image here. This leaves a knowledge gap of sorts where we don't have a concrete understanding of the geometries that are persistent and statistically relevant within the inertial subrange of scales, and specifically how they relate the larger scale velocity structures to the small scale dissipative motions. So investigating these geometries is the motivation for the work today. One idea that's been around since the 70s is the existence of fractal geometries in turbulence. There is evidence of fractal-like shapes existing in turbulent flows, where the earliest contributors to this research include Mandelbrot, Srinivasan, and Menevo. The nice thing about fractals is that they're naturally self-similar and yield power law statistics, both of which are hallmarks of the inertial subrange. However, there is limited evidence from observations of fractality that it is a specific feature of the inertial subrange. To give you an idea of what I mean by a fractal, in its mathematical definition, one of the properties is that if you zoom in on the object, it appears exactly the same as the zoomed out region, making it strictly self-similar. We don't expect this exact behavior for a turbulent flow. However, we expect something fractal-like or statistically self-similar, where if you zoom in on an image of a turbulent flow, the zoomed in region has the same shape properties as the overall region, making it statistically self-similar. To investigate fractals, we used existing boundary layer wind tunnel data from the University of Melbourne. This wind tunnel has a relatively high Reynolds number for laboratory scale settings, and the unique thing about this data is the 8-camera particle image velocimetry, as shown in the image here, which allowed us to capture a wide range of scales from 2 times the boundary layer thickness in the streamwise extent down almost to the Kolmogorov scales at the resolution of the images. We used these measurements to detect uniform momentum zones, or UMZs. These zones represent the elongated velocity structures corresponding to the production region of the energy spectrum, where the size of these coherent velocity regions increases with distance from the wall. These same features are present in the atmospheric surface layer and have been observed in a recent field measurement campaign previewed here. Returning to the wind tunnel data, we will specifically be looking at these black lines, which are lines of constant velocity that I will be calling velocity isosurfaces, and we will specifically be looking at the properties of the isosurfaces in the logarithmic region of the boundary layer. This is the region most closely analogous to the surface layer of the planetary boundary layer, where we expect an approximately constant momentum flux. First, we will be looking at the fractal dimension of these isosurfaces using the traditional box counting method. The two scales shown here are the approximate limits of the inertial subrange, and with the example isosurface, we count the number of boxes of size B required to enclose the shape, and then repeat the box count for a number of different box sizes. If the shape is self-similar, we expect a power law relation between the number of boxes and the box size, where the power law exponent d is the fractal dimension. Shown here are the box counting results of all of the isosurfaces at 4 positions within the logarithmic region. The offset between the 4 different symbols is simply for visualization, and the dashed vertical lines are the approximate inertial subrange limits. You can see an approximate power law within the inertial subrange for all of the positions. And we can look at this with more scrutiny by looking at the pre-multiplied box count using the approximate fractal dimension 1.2 in this case, and it yields a flat trend at all of the vertical positions within the log region, and the flatness is specifically within the inertial subrange. This indicates that the isosurfaces are self-similar, but the self-similarity is restricted to the inertial subrange. This is statistical behavior of the UMZ edges so far. However, we also want to know if this is a general feature of all velocity isosurfaces. So we also looked at statistics for isosurfaces displaced from the edges, and these are the gray statistics below the colored ones, and we see the same trends indicating that this self-similarity is a general feature of all isosurfaces within the boundary layer. This box counting result is one of the key takeaways for the presentation, where we see that these velocity isosurfaces have a wrinkled geometry. These wrinkles are statistically self-similar, such that the large wrinkles and the small wrinkles have the same geometric properties that are scale invariant. However, this self-similarity is strictly contained within the inertial subrange of scales, which is the precise region where we observe a power law in the energy spectrum and other scale-dependent statistics. With that in mind, for the rest of the talk, we'll be looking at how these wrinkles are actually reflected in the scale-dependent statistics. To do this, we'll be moving from the two-dimensional measurements to a one-dimensional representation using transects of the flow, where the vertical lines here are the positions where the one-dimensional signal crosses the convoluted isosurfaces. In the next slide, we'll be looking at probability distributions of the crossing intervals, or the distances between crossings of isosurfaces. This can be broken into 2 cases. The first is crossings of the same isosurface, which isolates the behavior of individual isosurfaces. And then the second case is crossings of different isosurfaces, which represents the overall extent of the velocity structures, where this is the distance between the two bounding isosurfaces of the momentum zones. Shown here is a number density distribution for a single height within the boundary layer. The number density is a probability statistic allowing us to compare the relative frequency of the 2 scenarios, where the overall statistic is simply a sum of the 2 individual cases. The intervals between the same interface yield a power law in the inertial subrange due to the self-similarity of the wrinkles, and this behavior has leading order importance in the inertial subrange. However, at larger scales, the overall extent of the momentum zones starts to create a cutoff behavior that limits the possible interval sizes that can be observed. We see the same trends for other wall normal positions where we have a power law in the inertial subrange, and then a cutoff behavior at the larger intervals. Now we would like to see how this crossing behavior translates to the structure function. To do this, we will create a simplified signal based on the crossing positions, where the signal is constant between the crossings and then changes in increments of 1, as shown in this animation here. Now, shown here at the top is another example signal where the difference in the adjacent velocity isosurfaces is approximately twice the standard deviation of the velocity signal, making this quite a coarse approximation of the velocity. And at the bottom, we have the second order structure function, which is a cousin to the energy spectrum in physical space, such that we expect a power law in the inertial subrange. Despite the coarseness of the simplified signal, we see a lot of the relevant trends in the structure function, namely the power law in the inertial subrange, and then a flattening to a logarithmic trend at larger scales. The power law here is directly related to the power law in the crossing intervals shown in previous slides. The one thing we don't capture very well is the 2/3 slope that we observe for the full velocity signal, and this is because we are neglecting all of the amplitude variability between the crossings. We can better represent the signal by simply adding isosurfaces at finer intervals. You can see now that we're adding new isosurfaces in a different color here in the bottom example, and this helps us to capture the variability in finer increments. These new isosurfaces have their own self-similar behavior in the inertial subrange that contributes to a change in the slope of the overall statistic. We can continue doing this by adding finer and finer intervals of the isosurfaces until we capture something that closely resembles the structure function of the full velocity signal. Before concluding, it's important to point out that it is possible to estimate the fractal dimension from 1D measurements. This is enticing for atmospheric studies that often rely on point measurements like sonic anemometry. To do this, you would create a zero crossing signal or telegraph approximation from your measured velocity or temperature. However, the result from this will be misleading and will not appear to be self-similar. This is a statistical consequence of a finite inertial subrange or finite Reynolds number, where more reasoning on this is given in a manuscript currently under revision. Just to show you a quick example, conducting a 2D box count on the wind tunnel measurements yields a nice flat curve in the pre-multiplied box count, which is an indicator of self-similarity within the inertial range. However, if you look at the same statistic on one-dimensional signals, you get something that does not appear to be self-similar in any way. To summarize what we've seen here today, if you are able to zoom in on the velocity structures in the surface layer, such as the low momentum streaks, you will see velocity isosurfaces that have a wrinkled geometry both along the edges of the velocity structures and internally within them, such that this is a persistent feature of the boundary layer. These wrinkles have a self-similar geometry where the large wrinkles have the same shape as the smaller ones. However, this self-similarity is restricted to the inertial subrange of scales. The physical restrictions on the wrinkles are the velocity structures limiting the largest wrinkle size and viscous smoothing limiting the smallest wrinkle size. These self-similar wrinkles yield power law statistics, including for the structure function, which reflects the collective behavior of numerous isosurfaces, such that this is giving us a more concrete understanding of the geometries within the inertial subrange that are persistent and statistically relevant. This is expected to be a universal feature of turbulence. However, to hopefully convince you that this is relevant to atmospheric applications, shown here are contours for planetary boundary layer simulations, where you see a lot of the same wrinkled geometries. However, with simulations, the size of the smallest wrinkles is determined by the grid resolution and the subgrid scale model. That closes out this oral presentation. Everything that I showed today, except where otherwise noted, is from a new article that's currently under peer review and will hopefully be published soon. However, in the meantime, a preprint is available on arXiv under the title shown here. And finally, we are grateful for funding support from the National Science Foundation. Thank you for attending this virtual talk.